that we've been running here. It's great to see so many familiar faces, but also some very new faces as well. And I hope that you find the next couple of days to be insightful, entertaining, but also educational. And I hope you're going to have a little bit of fun along the way. Over the 8 years that we've been running the event, we've been very privileged to have some great speakers, but none more so than this year. I think 2013, the roster was really stacked up to be a fantastic one. Which brings me to today's keynote speaker. During a career spanning 30 years, he's worked as a game designer, a programmer, a producer, a director. He's worked on arcade and console games in the US and in Japan. He's been likened to the David Beckham of the games industry, which I know that he's very happy about, although I don't think Bex has necessarily made such a great contribution towards games as he has. So with a list of credits as long as your arm, very few people have made such a great impact in and on our industry. So ladies and gentlemen, I give you the president of Cerny Games, Mark Cerny.
Pretty sure the David Beckham thing was a joke. So, good morning, Brighton, and thank you for making time today. I'd like to talk about the creation of the PlayStation 4, but also the general thinking behind my decision to make a game for the system, and my specific reasons for choosing Knack to be that game. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the evolving story of indie development and how it relates to PlayStation 4. And by way of introduction, I'm a game developer, initially working in the arcade business and moving to consumer games. And I've contributed to the creation of 30 or so games over the last 31 years. Now, it's very hard to separate my personal history and the history of the industry. So today, I'm going to approach this from an autobiographical and a historical perspective. And I'd like to start by sharing a little bit about what it was like to develop games 25 or 30 years ago. The challenges that we faced in those days, structural, technological, organizational, are so different from today as to be essentially unrecognizable. So I began my career at Atari. In 1982, I joined their coin-operated game division. This was during the final years of the golden age of the arcade. I joined Atari just a few months after the release of Centipede. And Atari was a very unusual place. The software for most of these games was created by just one person. You were expected to be the programmer, the game designer, and usually the artist as well. You simply had to be a jack of all trades. Now, despite the indie size of these software teams, this wasn't indie. These machines cost thousands of dollars and used dedicated hardware that needed to be designed, manufactured, and distributed, which meant that the software I was writing was just the tip of the iceberg. And even though the typical team size was just one person, we nevertheless had a formalized process for concept approval. And progress against milestones was scrutinized by several layers of management. And though I didn't know it, I joined Atari just as the golden age of the arcade was ending. We'd already managed to completely saturate the market. So the machines were everywhere, not just arcades, but convenience stores and supermarkets as well. The operators largely stopped buying them, sales dropped by a factor of 5 or so, and we had mass layoffs. And I ended up leaving Atari in 1985 to join Sega. And by the next year, I moved to Japan and started making console games with their team in Tokyo. Now, Sega was trying to break into a market that had first been dominated by Atari, and now was being dominated by Nintendo. They'd had moderate success with a 4-bit game console, and now were in the process of releasing an 8-bit home console called the Sega Master System. And one sign of the times was that there were essentially no third parties. A few titles were made by our one outside collaborator, Sunsoft. But other than that, the entire software lineup was created by a 40-person internal team. And we were busy. The typical title for the Master System was created by a team of 2, one programmer and one artist, in about 3 months. And almost none of the Sega talent spoke English, so I ended up learning quite good Japanese simply as a matter of survival. Now, the president at the time had a rather odd philosophy. He felt that title quantity was more important than title quantity. Which is to say that the Nintendo Entertainment System, that was the Nintendo console at the time, had 80 games for it. And then the Sega Master System had 40 games for it. Sega's president felt that the path to success was to make our software lineup larger than Nintendo's. And that turned out about as poorly as you might imagine. In the United States, we ended up with a 4% market share. You can compare that to Nintendo's 94%. In fact, none of the games we created were truly successful until the president changed his philosophy and decided to invest 5 times the usual resource into just one title. And that, of course, was Sonic the Hedgehog, which was Sega's first million seller. Now, after 7 years with Sega, I joined a startup called Crystal Dynamics. I was the first member of the first game team. And one of the main reasons I joined was that they would be doing very early game development for the 3D multiplayer, which we all thought would be the console that finally made 3D graphics possible. Now, to be clear, when I say 3D graphics, I just mean graphics as they appear in a modern video game, like a first-person shooter or an adventure game. In 1982, when I joined Crystal Dynamics, virtually all console games were side-scrollers or had top-down views. So as a result, after 10 years of making games, I finally had a chance to write a runtime graphics engine. And being an engine programmer for the first time was a tremendous learning experience, but unfortunately, one of the things I learned was that the 3DO hardware was simply too underpowered to provide a 3D game experience. The fairly unambitious games that I was working on tended to run at just 12 to 15 frames a second. So around this time, we started hearing about a more advanced console in its early prototype stage. It was called the PlayStation. Sony Computer Entertainment didn't have much of an organization in the US at the time. So on one trip to Japan, I went to Sony Computer Entertainment headquarters in Tokyo to see if I could get a dev kit. And I was told, no, they're only available to Japanese licensees, and English language contracts haven't even been created yet. So I said, that's fine, just think of Crystal Dynamics as a Japanese licensee for me. And I signed the Japanese contract. And amazingly, they sent us over a dev kit. I believe it was the first one that any US company received. And though I didn't know it at that time, we received that dev kit because a man in the business development group named Shuhei Yoshida saw me come in and thought, wow, this Mark guy might be going somewhere. And though it was very much against the rules, Shu approved that dev kit. Now, I never got a chance to use the dev kit because in 1994, I got a very big break. Universal Studios, which was one of the major entertainment conglomerates, had decided to enter the cutting-edge world of multimedia. And they weren't really sure what multimedia was, but they noticed that Myst and the Seventh Guest had been selling quite well, and they wanted to be sure that they weren't left behind. And as a result, I was recruited to help start up their new interactive entertainment group, which was called, simply enough, Universal Interactive Studios. I was initially vice president of product development, and later on president of the company. Now, the best part about this was that Universal didn't really know the business, and as a result, I had a great big bag of money to spend and no supervision. My belief was that multimedia was just video games by another name, so I focused on making games for PlayStation. And I was finally able to set the principles under which game creation would occur. I focused on quality over quantity, and threw out lengthy design and technical documents. It's hard to believe that start to finish, my time at Universal Interactive Studios was just 4 years. I was producer and executive producer for the first time, and I started by searching for the talent that would make our studio a success. We ended up signing a 3-person company called Naughty Dog, and the result was Crash Bandicoot. We signed a 2-person startup called Insomniac Games with no prior experience making games, and the result was Spyro the Dragon. And part of the reason behind our success was that we were able to spend $2 or $3 million a time, which in those days ensured the highest production values. Also, we benefited from a streamlined approach. We'd just write a 4-page concept and dive right into the game development. We didn't try to overly plan the initial stages of game creation. Altogether, the titles we created in those first years went on to sell more than 20 million units. Now, these were PlayStation titles, and as we didn't have much of a sales and marketing organization of our own, we ended up licensing distribution rights to Sony Computer Entertainment. Ken Kutaragi handpicked the producer who would work with us on Crash Bandicoot, which made me a little nervous. But as an amazing coincidence, it turned out the producer was Shu Yoshida. So Shu, who had sent me that first dev kit in the US because he thought I might be able to do something with it, was indeed correct because Crash Bandicoot became the top-selling brand for PlayStation. But Shu did have a lot to do with this himself. We would never have been a hit title in Japan without his guidance. One other fun note from these early years is that there was a group of us I always thought of as as the Three Musketeers. In 1998 or so, Shu was heading up product development in Japan. Andy House was head of marketing for Sony Computer Entertainment, and I was producer on the titles. The three of us were almost exactly the same age. We were born within a year of each other. We must have been just 34 or 35 at the time, which seems incredibly young when I look back at it now. At any rate, when the contracts expired, Naughty Dog and Insomniac decided to work directly with Sony Computer Entertainment. And I had a difficult decision to make. Should I follow them? Or should I stay on as president of Universal Interactive Studios and rebuild? It was a tough decision, but I chose to continue working with those talented developers. So in 1998, I founded Cerny Games and have now spent the last 15 years working as a consultant, not only with Naughty Dog and Insomniac, but also a number of other companies within the PlayStation universe. So we had a busy 4 years with Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, but Ken Kutaragi had also been busy. He took the success of the first PlayStation as an opportunity to bring his vision for console hardware to a whole new level. By early 1999, working prototypes of PlayStation 2 had been completed, and a team of programmers was hard at work in a locked room in Tokyo, creating demo programs that would be used in the springtime reveal of the hardware. Now, Shugo Yoshida contacted me. He'd heard that the hardware was much more powerful, but that many were struggling with its complexity. He wanted to make sure that Naughty Dog and Insomniac, who would be creating early PlayStation 2 titles, got off to as fast a start as possible. So he extended an invitation. I could enter that locked room, sit alongside the demo team, and work on a graphics engine for PlayStation 2. And I ended up living in Tokyo for 3 months as the first American to get his hands on the system, and did indeed write a game engine that was eventually used as a reference point for the early engine work of those two developers. Now, Shu was right about complexity. It was a lot more time-consuming to get going on PS2 than it had been on PlayStation 1. I think of hardware complexity in terms of time to triangle, by which I mean not time to write some code that displays one triangle, that's trivial. I mean the time to create an engine that comes close to what the hardware is theoretically capable of in terms of triangle count. For PlayStation 1, time to triangle was just a month or two. All you had to do was call some library functions. But for PlayStation 2, it was something like half a year, as the programmers had to learn how to write efficient code in assembly for the vector units. These were very unusual embedded processors created specifically for PlayStation 2. And in a sense, this was our first wake-up call. Thanks to the much higher performance of PlayStation 2, game developers were able to radically increase the richness of the content that they were creating. Something like the world of Jak and Daxter simply would be impossible on any prior platform. But that richness came at a cost. Each game developer now needed a team of talented professionals who did nothing but write low-level graphics. And there was a loss of flexibility, too. If the creative director had some idea of where to take the game and change that idea, a lot of that low-level graphics code would need to be scrapped and rewritten. Now, despite all of that, in the end, it turned out very well for SCE. PlayStation 2 is, by many measures, the most successful console in the history of video games. And I had a great time. I spent a focused 4 years creating games for the platform, contributing primarily to the technology of Jak and Daxter and the design of Ratchet and Clank. Now, it's hard to imagine that in those days, we were just on a 5-year hardware cycle, meaning only 5 years between one generation of hardware and the next. So my time on PlayStation 2 was pretty brief. In 2003, I was working on just the second game in each of those two series when Shu Yoshida came by again with an idea. Shu is now head of SCEA product development. All of the US game teams reported to him, and he had concerns. Some of his concerns were about cost. There were many good teams in the US, but they were all working independently. And the size of the typical team had tripled over the last few years. Shu wondered if collaboration and technology sharing could reduce the cost of game development, or at least slow its rise. He also had concerns, which turned out to be justified, that the next platform transition might be even trickier. And he wanted to be sure that Sony Computer Entertainment America was up to the challenge of the PlayStation 3. We ended up forming a specialized technology group whose function was to spearhead SCEA's entry into the next generation. Shu thought Naughty Dog might be a good base of operations, and after some discussion with the founders, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin, we decided to free up some people from work on the Jak and Daxter sequel and use them as a base from which to grow the tech team. And we ended up naming the group the ICE team, which initially stood for the Initiative for a Common Engine. Its goal was to investigate advanced graphics and other technologies, and to build and disseminate early systems that might be of use to the various game teams as they began their preliminary next-generation work. So, even though we knew nothing about PlayStation 3 at the time, we suspected that the transition from PS2 to PS3 would be challenging. We could tell by looking at the PC graphics world that there had been a bit of a revolution. Something called programmable shading was now possible. What this meant was that a program could be run on every pixel in the game scenes, which opened up a lot of potential, but also meant that our approach to graphics needed to be scrapped and rewritten. So we on the ICE team had a lot to study up on. Now, there was another part to Shuyo Yoshida's plan as well. On PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, the hardware team had worked in complete isolation. They conceptualized the circuitry, they laid out the design, they built prototypes, they wrote documentation. And when the hardware was complete, they would hand the documentation off to developer support, who would brief the game teams. There was essentially no communication between the hardware team and the game creators. For PlayStation 3, Shuyo had amazingly gotten approval to embed ICE team members with the hardware team in Tokyo, meaning that these embedded programmers would sit side by side with the hardware team as the hardware was being designed and learn the details of what was being created. By breaking down this barrier between the game and the hardware teams, we felt that we would be able to start our game technology work at least a year faster. Now, as for who would join the hardware team, Shu's first choice was me. I was bilingual, working closely with a number of game teams, and I'd already done something similar for PlayStation 2. So in the late summer of 2003, I went to Tokyo and I entered the Sanctum Sanctorum, the top secret facility where the future of Sony computer entertainment was being planned. Now, my big surprise was that the hardware team was just a half dozen engineers in a mid-sized room in one of the many Sony buildings. I guess I'd expected something from a James Bond movie, or maybe a elite high-tech facility of sorts. This was the first lesson for me. These kinds of projects are driven by a couple people with the vision, and all they need to do the basic hardware design work is a desktop PC. Now, at the time, the design of Cell was done, and the hardware team was hard at work on the graphics processor that would complete the system. Cell was Ken Kutaragi's brainchild, and the SPUs in Cell are like a supercomputer on a chip. They have very high performance, but to get that performance, you have to master their equally high complexity. What you need to do is pick up a small objective, maybe just a single short loop that does fairly simple processing. Then you break it down into various sub-operations. And finally, you need to solve a puzzle, how to optimally perform those sub-operations on the SPUs. If you can do it, the result is tremendous performance, but as a programmer, it's kind of like a Rubik's Cube. And it's pretty much like that the first 100 times you sit down to write a program. In other words, the SPUs had huge potential, larger than any conventional CPU, but a correspondingly huge effort was required to achieve that potential. So I and a few of the other members of the ICE team ended up shuttling back and forth between the US and Japan. When in Tokyo, we'd learn about the hardware being built and try writing code for it in emulation to test our understanding. When in the US, I'd work with the other ICE team members to design a software architecture that could be used in the first-party games. This was an exciting time, and it was a scary time. It was exciting because the technology was so new, and if used properly, so powerful. It was scary because it was hard to figure out how to do even the most basic tasks on the hardware. Now, after a year or so of this, at which point our little team had grown to more than a dozen programmers, we started to have confidence that we'd done it. We'd cracked the code, we'd solved the puzzle, we'd figured out how to make games for the hardware. We were happy. We were happy because now there was potential for some fantastic titles to come out of the first-party teams in the US. And we were also happy because we now had a tremendous lead over any third-party team that would try to make games for the platform. The third parties hadn't even been briefed yet on PlayStation 3, let alone started work on their engines. Our feeling was that Electronic Arts and Rockstar better watch out. Our proprietary first-party systems were going to show them just who had the right stuff. Now, this was, of course, completely the wrong attitude. But at the time, we just didn't know any better. We were all working on behalf of Sony Computer Entertainment's US game teams, and we were just thinking about our games. We didn't think about the platform at all. Now, by this time, it was already early 2005, and the hardware launch was set for holiday 2006, less than 2 years away. Our focus changed from creating shared technology to trying to develop launch and launch window titles. And we had to come face to face with the very tough fact it was going to be quite difficult to create those titles. One problem that surfaced was that the emphasis up until this point had been 99% hardware and 1% software. PlayStation 3 hardware was now close to a reality, but the teams lacked many of the tools necessary to make their titles. There was no quality debugger for SPUs. There were no GPU debug and performance analysis tools. There was no low-level graphics driver, and the development environment was in a very primitive state. The first-party teams were having a difficult time of it, but the third-party teams, without the luxury of being able to focus just on the PlayStation 3, and without the benefit of our early start, were having an even more trying time. Another problem we faced was that time to triangle had taken an enormous leap. The teams that I worked with in first party needed basically a whole year to create usable graphics engines. The sky-high expectations for the game titles could only be met through clever use of SPUs, but both the unique nature of Cell and the primitive state of the development environment meant that game creation on PlayStation 3 was more time-consuming than any previous platform. Fortuitously, due to the more open nature of PlayStation 3 in its development process, the various technology teams, such as the ICE team, were already fully briefed on the hardware and had, in fact, quite a bit of experience with it. That meant that these teams had the knowledge and resources to start independently creating various tools and technologies that would make PlayStation 3 game development easier. We'd also finally and collectively figured out that third parties were essential to the platform's success. In late 2005, the various first-party game teams in Japan, the US, and Europe were merged to form the worldwide studio. And one of our first tasks was to figure out which first-party tech teams had the strongest tools and technologies, and how best to share these formerly proprietary systems with the worldwide studio's software competitors. PlayStation 3 did ultimately launch in late 2006, and though we couldn't address all of these issues in time for launch, which resulted in a rather weak initial software lineup, we came out of this difficult time with some strengths. Those 3 years around launch, 2005, 2006, 2007, were a unifying experience. Anybody who lived through those times at Sony Computer Entertainment understands the need for international collaboration, the value of frank and open conversation. The franker the better, we're all in this together. The importance not just of hardware, but also software and tools, and the vital role of third parties in the success of the platform. Conversations that would have been impossible to have in 2004 were just an everyday way of doing business by 2008. Now, after PlayStation 3 shipped, the hardware team immediately started working on reducing the manufacturing cost of the console. In 2007, they also began a post-mortem analysis, investigating what had worked and what hadn't, with the goal of beginning to determine the basic direction to take with the next console. In other words, this was the initial step in the creation of the PlayStation 4. And for the first time in Sony Computer Entertainment's history, this process was inclusive and collaborative. The ICE team and other tools and technology teams were invited to participate. The most obvious path forward was to continue to use Cell. Though the learning curve had been steep, it was clear that the mastery of the SPUs was leading to some amazing games like Uncharted and Drake's Fortune. So it was definitely an option to continue using Cell, and maybe even enhancing it to make it more powerful or more easy to use. But there were other options too. We could move to a more conventional architecture with just a CPU and a GPU. If we went with that approach, choosing a CPU would be a very big issue because that would determine which vendor we work with, and thereby impact pretty much every aspect of our project: timeline, business structure, development cost, and the like. Now, there were two main possibilities for the CPU: the PowerPC architecture that we used in Cell in PlayStation 3, and the x86 architecture used in pretty much every modern PC. The conventional wisdom, as expressed by a number of the first-party game programmers, was that the x86 architecture was unusable in a game console. And I took this very seriously. A console needs to be competitive with a much more expensive PC. And if the game programmers need the more straightforward PowerPC architecture to make that happen, I understand. I just wondered if it was true, because the potential design space of PlayStation 4 was going to be pretty limited if we couldn't use the x86 CPU. So I ended up spending my November holiday in 2007 researching the 30-something year history of the x86, from its creation in the 1970s all the way through the most recent enhancements. And my conclusion was that the conventional wisdom had been right, but progressive enhancements by Intel and AMD over the years had finally resulted in something that the console game programmers could embrace. And then I started thinking, I just sacrificed my holiday to investigate some philosophical part for a console that I'm not really assigned to be working on, that won't be released for at least 5 years. That's passion, that's enthusiasm. Maybe I should consider working on this project more deeply. And then I started thinking about my skill set. I'd been a designer and a generalist programmer when I was making games at Atari. I'd become fluent in Japanese through my years at Sega. I'd programmed graphics engines at Crystal Dynamics and Naughty Dog. I'd worked as a executive producer in my time at Universal Studios, and I was certainly willing and able to travel. And I began to believe that I had the necessary expertise and experience to make a larger contribution. Because whoever led that next generation effort needed to have most of those skills. That person needed to be highly technical, like an engine programmer, but at the same time, that person would need to understand the larger process of making games, like a producer. And given the Japanese nature of the company and the broad geographical distribution of the various technology teams, it was necessary to be bilingual and willing to travel. And I knew it was a bit audacious. But I then went to Shu Yoshida, and I pitched him on the idea that I would be lead architect for PS4, and I asked him if he thought it was possible. And to my amazement, Shu said, yes, it's a good idea. So I went to the head of the worldwide studio, who also agreed. Then I went to Masa Chitami, who was the CTO at the time, and to my amazement, Masa said yes. But I would have to leave the worldwide studio and work through SCE headquarters instead, because that's, of course, where the hardware project would be based. Now, when I say leave the worldwide studio, I wasn't really leaving them because I was never a member. I'd been consulting on over a dozen worldwide studio game projects as certain games. And when I started working with Sony Computer Entertainment headquarters, that was once again as a consultant, meaning that I had no formal responsibility whatsoever because I was not part of company management. I was not even a company employee. If you contrast my position with that of Ken Kutaragi, who was both the chairman of Sony Computer Entertainment and the hardware visionary, the gap is huge. He had complete responsibility, not just for the hardware, but all aspects of the company. But in the long run, I think my lack of formal status has been of great benefit to me and to SCE. As a consultant, I manage no employees. I'm not responsible for budgets. I don't give presentations to other divisions of Sony. I don't track progress versus milestones. I don't negotiate contracts. I'm free to think about where we need to be in 5 years' time and work with the appropriate groups inside or outside of the company in order to make that happen. In some ways, it's a bit like being a director on a game title. Which is to say that certainly there are many programmers and artists and designers involved when you make a game, but they report to managers, not to the director. And there's certainly a budget that has to be tracked when you make a game, but it's managed by the producer. The director's role is to shape the shared vision and communicate it to the team. At any rate, in early 2008, the development of PlayStation 4 began in earnest, and we followed the new principles. The chief architect was an American. That's pretty international. We immediately began frank and open conversations with some members of the teams. And we kicked off the software and the tools effort pretty simultaneously with the hardware development effort. Involving the third parties was tricky, though. We definitely wanted their input on the design, but we felt it would be a bad idea to go to the teams that were making the top PlayStation 3 titles in 2008 and 2009 and start briefing them on a system that wouldn't be released for many years. It just felt like a tremendous distraction. So our solution was to make a questionnaire and present it to the third-party teams. We simply asked a lot of questions about the future of consoles and computer graphics and the specifics of what they would like to see in a next-generation game console. And I ended up talking to more than 30 teams in the US, Europe, and Japan. I'm glad I did, because the answers are not what I thought they would be. The number one piece of feedback that we received was to use unified memory, meaning just one high-speed pool of memory, not the two that are found on the PC or on PlayStation 3. We also learned that the proper CPU count was 4 or 8, and that if we had the money to spend, we should invest in a very powerful GPU. The final piece of feedback we received was that they didn't want exotic. If there was, for example, a GPU out there that could do real-time ray tracing, they did not want it in PlayStation 4. Certainly that would be a fascinating technology, but it would require the game teams to take several years, throw out all of their existing graphics technology, and rebuild it from scratch to use that exotic GPU. There were a few other milestones worthy of note. In 2008, Shu Yoshida became the new head of the worldwide studio and assumed responsibility for all game titles being created at SCE. And Ken Kutaragi received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences. I presented it to him at the ceremony. I'd like to say this photo is him passing the torch to me, but that's actually me handing him the incredibly heavy trophy at the awards dinner. Now, though Ken Kutaragi had largely left Sony by that point, we did think from time to time about what Ken would do if he were designing PlayStation 4. It was tough, though. Ken is a true genius. I remember at one point in 2004, during the development of the PlayStation 3, that I was talking about triangle count, at which point Ken said, in no uncertain terms, that anyone who talks about triangle counts is misguided. He'd just been to see one of the Lord of the Rings movies again, and his point was that we should be thinking about how to replicate the visuals of those movies, how to display 70,000 screaming orcs in real time with great visual fidelity, and not be thinking about micro issues like the triangle count that the hardware could support. So I'm not a camera, so I took a similar approach. In some ways, it was like Nolan Bushnell's famous philosophy for designing arcade games, that they should be easy to learn, but difficult to master. By that, he meant anyone should be able to put a quarter in an arcade machine and have fun playing immediately, but that there needed to be enough depth to the game that it would take several months for the players to fully develop their skills and to master. My variation on this was that the console should have a familiar architecture and be easy to develop games for in the early years of the console lifecycle, but that also there needed to be a rich feature set which the game creators could explore for years. To put a more specific timeline to that, perhaps some solid features for year one, and some very interesting additional features, perhaps more speculative ones, for year 3 or year 4 of the console lifetime. Another way to express our philosophy is that we didn't want the hardware to be a puzzle that programmers would need to solve in order to make quality titles. Just to give a specific example, and please forgive me, this gets technical very quickly. The architecture we ended up with for PlayStation 4 uses a 256-bit bus and a type of memory found on top-of-the-line PC graphics cards called GDDR5. The combination of this wide bus and this fast memory gets us 176 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, which, and many of you will have to take my word for this, is quite a lot. With that much bandwidth, straightforward programming techniques usually result in some pretty impressive graphics. Now, we knew that there was an alternative architecture that would be a bit easier to manufacture. In this architecture, we would use a narrower 128-bit bus, which would drop the bandwidth to 88 gigabytes per second. That's not particularly good in next-generation terms, and would really hurt the graphics performance. So we'd use some very fast on-chip memory to bring the performance back up. If we used EDRAM for this on-chip memory, we knew that bandwidths of as much as 1 terabyte a second, that's 1,000 gigabytes, would be achievable. The catch, though, is that the on-chip memory would need to be very small, and each team would need to develop special techniques to manage it in order to make their games. So, to compare these two architectures, the one on the left has 176 gigabytes per second for any access. The one on the right has either 88 gigabytes per second if the data is in system memory, or 1,000 gigabytes per second if the data is in the tiny EDRAM. And at first glance, the architecture on the right would seem far superior to the one on the left. Yes, it takes a while to figure out how to use it. But once you understand how to use that little cache of EDRAM, you can unlock the full potential of the hardware. But to our new way of thinking, the straightforward approach on the left is definitely advantageous. It gives you excellent day one performance, and we can find other features for the programmers to explore in later years. In other words, it may be counterintuitive, but 176 is definitely greater than 1,088. So here you can see the impact that the straightforward and familiar architecture of PlayStation 4 has had on time to triangle. It's basically back to where it was on PlayStation 1. It's great to be able to leverage the fact that almost all third-party teams already have an advanced engine that runs on PCs. Now, as I said earlier, we also wanted to ensure the longevity of the system. So we've worked hard to ensure that the console has a rich feature set, which will allow it to grow over the years and support the overall evolution of gaming. Our work focused on making sure that for those teams that were interested in investing the time, the GPU could be used far more than conventional graphics. Principally, we enhanced the GPU to make the use of asynchronous fine-grained compute practical on the platform. The asynchronous refers to how the GPU will be doing many tasks not directly linked to graphics: physics simulation, collision detection, raycasting for audio, decompression, and the like. And these operations are fine-grained, meaning that there will be many small world simulation tasks running simultaneously on the GPU alongside rendering of the game scenes. As game developers learn to use these techniques later on in the console lifecycle, we will see richer and even more interactive worlds. Now, of course, there's a lot more that goes into a game console than just the CPU, the GPU, and the system memory. There are a great number of decisions that need to be made regarding hardware, system software, and the larger user experience that surrounds the games. Part of our strategy for reconciling the many differing opinions in these areas has been to adopt a fundamentally developer-driven process. What that means is when there are important decisions that need to be made, we run them by our collaborators in first and third party. Even when the decisions seem unanimous internally, I still tend to give presentations to the game teams, explaining the rationale for the decisions that we're making. Now, I'm sure you're thinking that talking to developers and listening to their feedback sounds pretty simple, but the truth is it's quite a bit trickier than that. The first reason is that the people you want to be talking to are the best of the best, the lead engineers of world-class companies like EA, Ubisoft, Rockstar, Capcom, Activision, and the like. And in order to be able to have sustained conversations with these busy people, you have to demonstrate that your technical understanding is of a level comparable to theirs. Part of our strategy here was to prepare extraordinarily detailed presentations. That's where we show our passion for technology and our expertise. And doing all of that preparation also helps address another issue, which is that you don't ever want to be in the position of not being able to answer a question. Then you need to get out on the road with your 500 PowerPoint slides and do that 8-hour presentation, which I've done, for example, in the summer, in Tokyo, in Japanese, in a room without air conditioning, standing up and holding a heavy microphone in my hand. Your whole body aches the next day. And then you have to be prepared for any reaction at all. I wasn't there for the meeting when one of our developers said, if the PlayStation 4 doesn't have 8 gigabytes of memory, then Sony is dead. But I have flown thousands of miles to get booed by the audience in the middle of the presentation. It's tough, but it's eye-opening too. That sort of passion lets us know when we're on the wrong track and need to come up with a new direction. And the payoff is huge for doing things this way. The hard drive, to give an example, in every PlayStation 4 is great for downloading content. But more specifically, what it's doing is enabling the developer dream of living software, where every time you return to play the game, there's something new to experience, new places in the world to explore, new missions, and so on. Without actively and continuously soliciting developer feedback, we never have understood where the game creators will be taking their titles in the next decade. So now that I've gone through the hardware philosophy, I'd like to take a bit of time to explain how NAC, the PlayStation 4 title that I'm directing, fits into all of this. One of the issues that I personally faced in 2008 when I began my work as lead system architect was whether or not I should continue working directly on games. And I ended up having a heart-to-heart with Akira Sato, who was chairman of Sony Computer Entertainment at the time. His advice was that quite a lot of my value as architect was because of my game work, and to give up the game work would put me on a path that would reduce my long-term ability to contribute to the organization. So if at all possible, he suggested that I should continue working directly on games. The next question was what I would do on the game titles. I've been working to support creative directors like Ted Price and Jason Rubin in any way that I could, but team size and project complexity kept growing and growing. And that meant that my work had changed from something critical, such as laying out essentially all of the levels in the second Crash Bandicoot game, to something much smaller, such as script doctoring or usability testing on God of War 3 or Killzone 3. What I ultimately decided was to be director on a smaller title, The worldwide studio has a group in Tokyo called the Japan Studio, which has been responsible for Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, Loco Roco, and a number of other game titles over the years. And I knew the group very well because in the PlayStation 3 years, I've been responsible for transferring technology from the ICE team to the game teams there at the studio. It seemed like a nice fit. Plus, I needed to be in Tokyo every month anyway for the hardware. Now, what the Japan studio and I chose to make was a character action game with two audiences in mind. One audience was core gamers. I wanted to tap into the nostalgia for the game experiences of the past, that feeling you had when you played Crash Bandicoot or Sonic the Hedgehog for the first time. Crash was actually a brutally difficult game, despite its very simple two-button control scheme. So that meant, on a hard difficulty setting, our game really needed to challenge the core gamer. The other audience was light or beginner gamers, and I chose this because I have some very specific and personal beliefs about consoles and their position within the world of gaming. Console games can be pretty complex. If we just focus on the controller and the game's control scheme, there are something like 16 buttons on DualShock 3 or DualShock 4 that a game can use, and a typical AAA title will use almost all of them. Now, I'm personally comfortable with that. I started gaming in the era of the Atari 2600, which only had one button, but then I had decades to adjust to the increasing complexity of games as they evolved to the point where they are today. More recently, the children of the 1990s typically started by playing handheld game systems with their simpler controls, and then moved to home consoles. In a sense, the handheld game systems were training them to be console players. But today, the trends are quite different. Young children are playing games on smartphones and tablets, as are many adults who have never played video games before. The ease of interactions with touchscreens is so high that pretty much anyone can play Fruit Ninja on an iPad. So we have this gulf that's developing for many light, young, or beginner players between what they're familiar with when playing a game and what's required to play a modern AAA title. Now, certainly the touchscreen games on Vita and motion-based gaming using the PlayStation camera work to bridge this gap, but I started to think about creating a game that would firmly have a foot in both worlds. By that, I mean a game that was very much a story-driven action-adventure, but at the same time, a game that could act as sort of an on-ramp to the world of console gaming, something that on an easy difficulty setting would be playable by pretty much anyone, regardless of their gaming history or habits. So that is the origin of NAC, a game where you can play it on hard for that old-school core gamer challenge, but on easy, it can be someone's first console game. Now, it has proved challenging to build that game. Playtests show that much of what we believe has broad accessibility, such as those cute mascot games of years gone by, turn out to be essentially unplayable by light gamers. So our quest to make the on-ramp to the world of console games has taken us to some rather interesting places. And just to give you one example, our testing showed that 8-year-olds have difficulty with the control schemes of many games. The issue was not the complexity of the control scheme, as much as simply the size of the controller compared to the size of their hands. So as part of our design process, we ended up making a giant controller, 50% larger than usual, so that we could directly experience what it feels like to be a child playing a game. And we immediately understood that the shoulder buttons are simply out of reach for the typical 8-year-old, but that all the face buttons could be used quite readily. There was, of course, another benefit to wearing the two hats of game director and system architect, which is that it made it easier to speak to the various first and third-party game teams about PlayStation 4. I didn't need to talk as a technologist. I could talk as a game creator with direct experience using the hardware, software, and development environment. So when I went around explaining just how simple the hardware was to work with, that was something I'd seen for myself on NAC, which had just a skeleton staff of programmers through much of the project. It also made conversations about PlayStation 4 much more concrete. If the topic was support for our play-as-you-download system or support for our new Friends Network, I could talk about what I was doing on my game. And since my game was a smaller title, any solutions or strategies I had would usually be simple to adopt by the larger teams. So I'd like to change topics one more time and talk about indie development on PlayStation 4. And before I get into the details, it's probably best to explain what we think of as an indie game, it's as much defined from what indie isn't as what it is. Indie isn't big budget AAA titles created with 100 internal staff plus outsourcing. To us, it's smaller, nimbler titles, whatever they might be. These could be freeform, emotive experiences like Flower, but they could also be free-to-play first-person shooters like Zombie Studios' Blacklight Retribution. It's all about what the game developer wants to create and then finding a way to assist them to make it and help find its audience. So if we go back to the first PlayStation, there was no way to make an indie title. The hardware did not support digital downloads, and there was nowhere to store a game locally. All games were distributed on CD-ROMs. We did have an inexpensive dev kit called Net Yarose that allowed hobbyists to create their own games, but there was no way for these creators to directly reach their audience. The games typically ended up being included in a free CD-ROM in the official PlayStation magazine. At the same time, though, AAA game development was very different from what it is today. Team sizes were quite small. For example, Crash Bandicoot, a title that sold 6 million units, was created by just 7 people. And there was truly minimal specialization at that time, which meant a typical individual would contribute broadly in the creation of the game. For example, there were no dedicated game designers on that first Crash game. The background artists would freehand the levels into the modeling software. And I remember Jason Rubin coming to me with what he thought was a crazy idea at the time, that there'd be an artist on the project who did nothing but create textures. More importantly, though, due to the very small team sizes, the barriers to creating new types of experiences were quite low, and consequently, the diversity of games available at retail was quite high. As a result, there was a certain fun factor that was an intrinsic part of the PlayStation DNA in those years. Concept-driven titles like Parappa the Rapper, Devil Dice, or Intelligent Cube were very well received by the game-playing audience, and each went on to sell over 1 million units. When PlayStation 2 was released, the hardware became powerful enough to support much more realistic worlds, which meant a correspondingly greater emphasis on the assets that would be needed within the game. The result was roughly a tripling in team size, and even a conceptually driven title such as Katamari Damacy now needed a much larger team due to its reliance on background art, character models, and the like. There was an accompanying increase in specialization. Very focused roles such as combat designer or character rigger became quite common during this time. And of course, we've seen these trends accelerate in the PlayStation 3 generation. The photorealistic game of today might take hundreds of professionals to create, and the typical team member tends to have quite a specific role, such as lighting design or work having to do with some technical aspect of motion capture. These larger titles have, of course, been very appealing to the game-playing audience. Heavy content, such as Skyrim or Assassin's Creed, increasingly dominates the sales charts. At the same time, many developers are looking for a more intimate relationship with the game being created, and players are looking for lighter and more diverse, but equally compelling game experiences that will balance out these larger titles. Consequently, each year that goes by, there are more small teams following their indie dreams. Some are seeking to make a deeper and broader individual contribution than they had on AAA titles. For others, the lure is the complete freedom to set their own direction, or the possibility of owning and controlling their own IP. Thanks to the hard drive and internet connection in PlayStation 3, digital delivery of content has, of course, become possible. And from the early days of the console lifecycle, we've been working both to directly create these unique experiences at the worldwide studio, and also to foster the development elsewhere. We feel it is essential to bring these games to our platforms because we know that variety of experience is a key part of the appeal of PlayStation. In 2006, though, at the time of the launch of PlayStation 3, there were a number of obstacles to the full integration of smaller content. One issue that we encountered was with process and infrastructure. Over the course of 3 home consoles, Sony Computer Entertainment created an organization optimized to support the publishing of large titles. And the publishers likewise created organizations focused on building that bigger content. That meant that the systems in place at SCE in those early PS3 days with concept approval, format QA, or the like were designed with the timeframes and costs of AAA content in mind. Another issue that we encountered arose from the exotic technology of the PlayStation 3. In some cases, this became inspiration to indie developers. Flower and Pixel Jump Shooter were in many ways born out of the question of how SPUs can be used to create distinctive visuals and unique gameplay. But more often than not, the architecture of the hardware in the early days of the PlayStation 3 hampered indie development on the platform. We've therefore worked hard to make PlayStation platforms a more welcoming place for indie titles. Part of our approach has been streamlining our processes. Part has been technology initiatives such as Fire Engine that make game development easier on the platforms. And part has been discoverability to ensure that gamers can easily search and find these titles in the PlayStation Store. And the result has been a broad array of first and third-party titles. And the console audience has woken up to the potential of indie games. Last year's Walking Dead won a stunning number of awards, and that game company's journey was widely regarded as Game of the Year. Now, with the release of PlayStation 4, we understand that we have an opportunity to fundamentally alter the landscape of gaming. On the technology side, the supercharged PC architecture of the platform has made it both easier to develop, easier to bring indie titles to PlayStation 4, and easier to develop original titles directly on the platform. Even if the games use simpler graphics engines, the increased system memory means that it is trivial to support larger animation sets or more detailed virtual worlds. On PlayStation 4, I believe the indie paradigm will have the hardware as enabler, not as the central player. Which is to say that Octodad isn't about the triangle count. It's about keeping your cephalopod in nature a secret from your human family. On the business side, we've had a bit of an epiphany. Since Adam Boyes joined SCE, pretty much the whole process has been overturned. He wanted us to look at the day in the life of an indie developer and challenged us to explain whether our processes were helping or hindering the creation of the diverse titles that we were looking for. And we ended up radically simplifying concept approval. We fully support self-publishing across all platforms, so it's now possible for developers to maintain complete creative and financial control. We now pretty much support any business model, whether it be buy-to-play, free-to-play, episodic, or microtransactions. And we're doing what we can to support indie development financially as well, whether that be through loaner dev kits, or our incubation program, or direct support from the Pub Fund. We also understand that accessibility is paramount, so we've gone from putting our process out front to putting people out front. Which is to say that your indie journey on PlayStation 4 as a developer begins by tweeting Shahid Ahmad, not by filling out a form. A number of aspects of the PlayStation 4 user interface also foster growth of the indie sector. The share button allows the games community to easily elevate the visibility of game experiences that they find compelling. And we've brought heightened immediacy to digital distribution on PlayStation 4. The process of purchasing titles has been radically simplified. And once purchased, not only do games download in the background, but thanks to our new network infrastructure, it is possible to play the games even as they are being downloaded. So as a result of these technical, business, and platform factors, we believe that a renaissance of gaming is coming on PlayStation 4. Heavy content will thrive on the platform, but in many ways we will also be returning to the creative freedom and broad content that made the early years of PlayStation so unforgettable. And it was a thrill, personally, to be able to present indie games side by side with AAA titles. At first, the New York Announce event, and then more spectacularly at E3, where the title count of playable indie games that we showed rivaled that of big budget titles. And it wasn't just title count, these were remarkable titles as well. Transistor was honored as the best downloadable game at E3 by the Game Critics Awards. As Adam Boyes says, we want to provide gamers with an endless variety of beautiful, challenging, and fantastic experiences, and the passion of small teams will be critical in transforming that goal into reality. So that is the story behind the development of PlayStation 4, my feelings on what the future will bring for gaming on the platform. And I would like to leave you with a few final thoughts. The first is that if you want to know what I'll be doing in 5 years' time, don't ask me, I don't know, ask Shu Yoshida. It's all part of his master plan. The reason there's a game developer deep inside the hardware team is that Shu had the patience and foresight to make it happen. And finally, the three musketeers are back. Andrew House was appointed president of SCE in 2011. And one of the small results of that, but huge for me, is that it provided a further boost to the policies of engagement with game developers around the world. I have a great friend who lives in Kyoto, in the eastern part of Japan. He runs a developer there, and he's worked with both Sony Computer Entertainment and Nintendo over the years. He says that what he respects the most about Nintendo is the incredible continuity that they have, in the form of a core group of individuals that has now worked together for over 30 years. Well, we on the PlayStation side of the business only have about 20 years together now, but I'm really looking forward to the next decade or two with Shu, Andy, and the other amazing talents at Sony Computer Entertainment. And I think by the end of it, we'll even have a friend in Kyoto telling everyone how our values, held strongly over a great period of time, had such an influence over the world of games. And that is the talk. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a very, very insightful talk, so we appreciate that. We're going to take a break now and look forward to seeing you all in the other sessions throughout the rest of the day. So enjoy it. Thank you.